Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that might make your holiday dinner conversations a little more uncomfortable. The story you learned about Thanksgiving in elementary school, the one with smiling pilgrims and grateful Native Americans sharing turkey and corn around a peaceful table, that story is a lie. And not just a small omission or a gentle reshaping of events. It's a carefully constructed myth designed to hide one of the darkest chapters in American history. Before we go any further, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about American history. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how many of us are searching for truth together, no matter what corner of the world we're in. Now, settle in, maybe dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey that will completely reshape how you see one of America's most beloved holidays. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just history. It's the foundation of how an entire nation learned to celebrate genocide while calling it gratitude. The real story of Thanksgiving doesn't begin in 1621 with a harmonious feast. It begins much earlier, with a man whose life embodied every horror that European colonization brought to indigenous peoples. His name was Tisquantum, though you probably know him as Squanto, and his story, when told truthfully, reveals the brutal machinery of violence, enslavement, and disease that made that famous first Thanksgiving possible. In 1614, 7 years before the Pilgrims ever set foot on Plymouth Rock, Tisquantum was living peacefully in his village of Patuxet. He was a member of the Wampanoag Confederation, a sophisticated network of tribes that had thrived in what is now Massachusetts for thousands of years. These weren't primitive societies struggling to survive. The Wampanoag had developed complex agricultural systems, intricate trade networks, and political structures that governed tens of thousands of people across dozens of villages. But on that day in 1614, everything changed for Tisquantum. Captain Thomas Hunt, an English slaver operating under the authority of John Smith, arrived on the coast with a simple mission. He wasn't there to trade or explore. He was there to capture human beings and sell them into bondage. Hunt lured Tisquantum and 19 other Patuxet men aboard his ship under the pretense of trade. Once they were on board, they were chained in the hold like cargo. Hunt's ship sailed directly to Malaga, Spain, where indigenous people from the Americas were sold in slave markets alongside Africans. This wasn't an isolated incident or some rogue operation. Between 1492 and 1880, historians estimate that between 2 and 5.5 million indigenous Americans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic. Tisquantum was just one number in this massive system of human trafficking that most Americans have never heard about. The details of Tisquantum's enslavement remain largely unknown, but we do know he somehow managed to escape or was rescued by Spanish monks who opposed the slave trade. He eventually made his way to London, where he learned English and spent several years trying to find passage back to his homeland. In 1619, 5 years after his kidnapping, Tisquantum finally returned to Patuxet. What he found there would haunt anyone's nightmares. His village was gone. Not abandoned, not relocated, but completely destroyed. Overgrown cornfields stretched where houses once stood. Personal belongings lay scattered and rotting, and everywhere, bleached white bones littered the ground like fallen leaves. His entire tribe, every person he had ever known, was dead. Tisquantum had returned home to find himself the sole survivor of what historians now call the Great Dying. Between 1616 and 1618, a plague brought by earlier European explorers had swept through the Wampanoag Confederation like wildfire. This wasn't just a bad epidemic, it was demographic catastrophe on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Before the plague, the Wampanoag Confederation consisted of 69 villages, with an average population of about 1,000 people each. 69,000 people living in a complex society that had existed for millennia. In just 2 years, the plague killed approximately 50,000 of them. 2/3 of an entire civilization gone. Villages that had stood for generations became graveyards. Trade routes that had connected communities for hundreds of miles fell silent. Political alliances that had maintained peace for decades collapsed. The disease that caused this devastation was most likely bubonic plague, though some historians argue it could have been smallpox or typhus. What's certain is that it came from European contact. Indigenous Americans had no immunity to Old World diseases because their ancestors had migrated to the Americas before these pathogens evolved in densely populated European and Asian cities. When European explorers and fishermen began visiting the New England coast in the early 1600s, they brought death with them in their very breath. This wasn't natural selection or some inevitable consequence of two worlds meeting. This was biological warfare, whether intentional or not. European diseases became weapons of mass destruction, clearing the land of its indigenous inhabitants more effectively than any army could have managed. And the Europeans knew it. They wrote about it in their letters and journals, often with a sense of divine providence, as if God himself was clearing the wilderness for them. So when the Mayflower landed at Plymouth in December 1620, the Pilgrims weren't settling virgin territory or unused land. They were building their colony on top of Patuxet, Tisquantum's destroyed village. They were literally living among the bones of the dead, planting their crops in fields that had been cleared by people who were no longer alive to defend them. The Pilgrims found cleared fields, fresh water sources, and even stores of corn that had been left behind by the plague's victims. They called it God's providence. But it was actually demographic catastrophe. This is where Tisquantum's story becomes both tragic and ironic. When the Pilgrims arrived, they were dying. They had landed in the middle of winter with inadequate supplies and no knowledge of how to survive in this environment. Half of them died during that first winter. They probably all would have died if not for Tisquantum. In March 1621, this man who had lost everything, who had been enslaved by Europeans and had returned home to find his entire world destroyed by European diseases, walked into the Pilgrim settlement and offered to help them. Speaking perfect English, learned during his years of captivity, he taught them how to grow corn, where to fish, how to navigate the political landscape of the surviving tribes. He literally saved the colony that was built on his people's graves. The famous feast of 1621, the one we call the First Thanksgiving, happened because Tisquantum brokered a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and Massasoit, the leader of the surviving Wampanoag. But this wasn't some idyllic celebration of friendship between cultures. It was a desperate political alliance. Massasoit needed European weapons and support to defend his weakened people against rival tribes who had not been as devastated by the plague. The Pilgrims needed indigenous knowledge and protection to survive in an environment they barely understood. The feast lasted 3 days and probably included about 50 pilgrims and 90 Wampanoag warriors. But calling it Thanksgiving is misleading. The Pilgrims didn't call it that. They had their own tradition of Thanksgiving, which were religious fasts followed by feasts to celebrate God's providence. This 1621 gathering was more like a diplomatic summit with meals, a political necessity disguised as celebration. And here's what really matters about this story. Within 50 years, the children and grandchildren of the people who shared that meal would be killing each other in one of the bloodiest wars in American history. The peace that Tisquantum helped create was temporary, fragile, and built on fundamentally incompatible worldviews about land, religion, and civilization. But before we get to that war, we need to understand how Thanksgiving as a holiday actually began. Because the truth is, the first official Thanksgiving proclamation in New England had nothing to do with Pilgrims and Wampanoag sharing a meal. It was declared in 1637 to celebrate a massacre, the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638. marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across the continent for the next 2.5 centuries. English colonists, frustrated by indigenous resistance to their expansion, decided to solve the problem with overwhelming violence. The Pequot tribe, like the Wampanoag, had initially tried to coexist with European settlers. They had signed treaties, engaged in trade, and attempted to navigate the complex political situation created by colonial expansion. But tensions escalated throughout 1636 as colonists continued to encroach on Pequot territory and demanded tribute payments the tribe couldn't afford. Small skirmishes broke out, cattle were killed, homes were burned. The kind of border conflicts that happen when two different societies with different concepts of land ownership try to share the same space. The English response was not proportional. In May 1637, a colonial militia led by Captain John Mason surrounded the main Pequot village at Mystic River in Connecticut. It was early morning, and most of the Pequot warriors were away. The village was filled primarily with women, children, and elderly people. Mason's forces set the village on fire and shot anyone who tried to escape the flames. What happened next was systematic slaughter. Between 500 and 700 people were killed that morning. Most burned alive in their homes. Those who ran from the fire were shot down like animals. The colonial forces showed no mercy, no quarter, no recognition that they were killing human beings. They saw it as extermination of vermin, clearing the land of obstacles to civilization. And when it was over, when the screaming stopped and the smoke cleared, the colonial leadership declared a day of thanksgiving to celebrate their victory. Governor John Winthrop proclaimed, "This blessed day, the vanquishing of the horrid savage Pequot. I officially declare, from this day forward, for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to celebrate annually an official day of thanksgiving." This wasn't hidden or secret, it was official policy. The Massachusetts Bay Colony established Thanksgiving as an annual holiday to commemorate the successful massacre of indigenous people. And this became the template. After every successful raid, every burned village, every pile of indigenous bodies, the colonists held Thanksgiving feasts. They kicked severed heads through the streets like footballs. They displayed scalps as trophies. They turned genocide into a religious celebration. The pattern continued for years. Following successful raids in what is now Stamford, Connecticut, the churches announced additional days of Thanksgiving. The killings became more frenzied, the celebrations more elaborate. Historical records describe these Thanksgiving feasts being held throughout New England, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Each successful massacre was followed by a religious celebration thanking God for delivering the heathen savages into their hands. Even the Wampanoag, who had saved the Pilgrims and maintained peace for decades, eventually fell victim to this system of violence. In 1675, tensions that had been building for years finally exploded into what became known as King Philip's War. Metacom, called King Philip by the English, was Massasoit's son and the new leader of the Wampanoag Confederation. Metacom had watched English settlements expand across Wampanoag territory for his entire life. He had seen his people forced to sell their land to pay debts imposed by colonial courts. He had watched English cattle destroy Wampanoag crops while colonial authorities refused to provide compensation. He had seen his people arrested and executed for crimes they didn't commit, tried in courts where they couldn't understand the language or the law. When Metacom's brother Wamsuta died suddenly in 1662 during negotiations with colonial authorities, many Wampanoag believed he had been poisoned. Whether true or not, it symbolized how the relationship between the two peoples had deteriorated since that first feast in 1621. The alliance that Tisquantum had helped forge was breaking down, and both sides were preparing for war. King Philip's War, when it finally came, was devastating beyond anything that had happened before. It lasted from 1675 to 1678 and resulted in the deaths of thousands of indigenous people and hundreds of colonists. Entire towns were burned. Families were slaughtered. The careful political balance that had maintained relative peace for 50 years collapsed into brutal, total warfare. The war ended with Metacom's death in 1676. He was shot by an indigenous ally of the English. Then his body was drawn and quartered like a common criminal. His head was cut off and displayed on a pole in Plymouth, where it remained for 24 years as a warning to any indigenous person who might consider resistance. His wife and 9-year-old son were sold into slavery in the Caribbean, joining thousands of other indigenous people who were exported from New England as human property. This is the real history behind Thanksgiving. Not a story of friendship and gratitude, but a narrative of invasion, disease, enslavement, and systematic extermination. The holiday we celebrate today was literally founded on the celebration of genocide. And this pattern, established in New England in the 1600s, would repeat itself across the entire continent as European Americans expanded westward. The sanitized version of Thanksgiving that most Americans learn in school isn't just inaccurate, it's actively harmful. It teaches children that colonization was peaceful and beneficial. It erases the experiences of indigenous peoples. It turns victims into willing participants in their own destruction. And it allows Americans to feel good about their history without confronting the violence that made their country possible. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The mythical version of Thanksgiving wasn't created by accident or through innocent misremembering. It was deliberately constructed in the 19th and 20th centuries by writers, educators, and politicians who wanted to create a unifying national story that would make Americans feel good about themselves and their history. The transformation of Thanksgiving from a celebration of massacre into America's most beloved family holiday didn't happen overnight. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign that took over 2 centuries to complete. And understanding how this myth was constructed reveals something deeply troubling about how Americans choose to remember their past. The process began in the 1840s with a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of Godey's Lady's Book, one of the most influential magazines of the 19th century. Hale had read about the 1621 feast between the Pilgrims and Wampanoag in a brief passage from a letter written by Plymouth colonist Edward Winslow. But she wasn't interested in historical accuracy. She was interested in creating a national holiday that would unite a country increasingly divided over slavery. Hale's version of Thanksgiving bore almost no resemblance to what actually happened in 1621. She invented the turkey as the centerpiece of the meal. She created the image of Pilgrim women in black dresses and white bonnets, serving grateful indigenous guests. She turned a 3-day diplomatic gathering into a single afternoon of domestic harmony. Most importantly, she completely erased any mention of the violence that followed. For 17 years, Hale lobbied presidents and politicians to establish Thanksgiving as a national holiday. She wrote letters, published articles, and used her magazine to promote her sanitized version of the story. She argued that Thanksgiving would remind Americans of their shared heritage and common values, conveniently ignoring the fact that this heritage included the systematic extermination of indigenous peoples. President Abraham Lincoln finally granted Hale's wish in 1863, declaring Thanksgiving a national holiday during the darkest year of the Civil War. Lincoln's proclamation called for Americans to give thanks for their blessings and to pray for healing of the nation's wounds. It was a beautiful sentiment, but the timing reveals something sinister about American priorities. Lincoln issued his Thanksgiving proclamation on October 3rd, 1863, just 10 months after approving the largest mass execution in American history. On December 26th, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously in Mankato, Minnesota, in front of a cheering crowd of 4,000 spectators. These men had been condemned to death following the Dakota War of 1862, a conflict that began when the federal government broke its promise to deliver food and supplies to Dakota tribes in exchange for their land. The Dakota people were literally starving. Government officials had delayed and stolen their treaty payments, leaving families without resources to survive the winter. When Dakota leaders demanded the food they had been promised, a white trader named Andrew Myrick reportedly told them, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." Within weeks, desperate Dakota warriors began raiding white settlements, killing hundreds of civilians in a desperate attempt to drive the invaders from their territory. The trials that followed were a mockery of justice. Most lasted less than 5 minutes. The Dakota defendants had no lawyers, no interpreters, and no understanding of the legal proceedings against them. Many couldn't communicate with the court at all. Evidence was rarely presented. Guilt was assumed. Of the 392 Dakota men initially sentenced to death, Lincoln commuted most of the sentences, but still approved the execution of 38 men, many of whom were probably innocent of the crimes they were accused of. After the mass execution, surviving Dakota people were expelled from Minnesota entirely. Their reservation was dissolved, their remaining lands were seized, and more than 1,600 Dakota civilians were imprisoned in a concentration camp at Fort Snelling, where they spent the winter in horrific conditions. Hundreds died of disease and starvation. Children were separated from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to destroy their cultural identity. This is what was happening to indigenous people while Abraham Lincoln was establishing Thanksgiving as a national holiday. The president who is remembered for freeing enslaved African Americans was simultaneously approving the execution and exile of indigenous Americans. And the holiday he created was meant to celebrate American values of gratitude and unity, while those same Americans were committing genocide. The contradictions only became more stark as the 19th century progressed. While families gathered around Thanksgiving tables to give thanks for their blessings, the United States military was conducting a campaign of extermination against indigenous peoples across the Western Territories. The Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, the Washita River Massacre in Oklahoma, the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota, all of these atrocities happened during the era when Thanksgiving was becoming established as America's premier family holiday. At Sand Creek in 1864, Colonel John Chivington led 700 Colorado Territory militia in an attack on a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village. The indigenous leaders had been flying an American flag and a white flag of truce, believing they were under federal protection. Chivington's forces killed between 150 and 500 people, mostly women, children, and elderly men. They scalped and mutilated the bodies, cutting off body parts to keep as trophies. When news of the massacre reached Denver, it was celebrated in the local newspapers. The Rocky Mountain News reported that Colorado soldiers have again covered themselves with glory. The scalps and severed body parts were displayed in a Denver theater during intermission of a popular play, where the audience cheered and applauded. This happened just 1 year after Lincoln established Thanksgiving as a national holiday. The pattern continued throughout the late 1800s as American families gathered annually to give thanks while their government completed the conquest of the continent. The buffalo herds that had sustained plains tribes for millennia were systematically exterminated, often by hunters who took only the hides and left millions of carcasses to rot on the prairie. Indigenous children were stolen from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their native languages or practicing their traditional religions. By 1890, the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre, the indigenous population of the United States had fallen to its lowest point in history. From an estimated 5 to 15 million people before European contact, fewer than 250,000 indigenous Americans remained alive. It was the most successful genocide in human history, and it happened while Americans were celebrating Thanksgiving as a holiday of gratitude and family unity. But the construction of the Thanksgiving myth wasn't complete. The early 20th century saw an even more deliberate effort to sanitize and romanticize the holiday's origins. In 1920, as America emerged from World War I, the Mayflower Society and other Pilgrim heritage organizations launched a massive public relations campaign to promote the 1621 feast as the first Thanksgiving. This campaign coincided with growing concerns about immigration and American identity. Millions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had arrived in the previous decades, bringing different languages, religions, and cultural traditions. White Protestant Americans, particularly those who claimed descent from the original English colonists, were eager to establish their version of American history as the definitive narrative. The Pilgrim story was perfect for this purpose. It portrayed the founders of America as devoutly religious refugees seeking freedom from persecution. It depicted them as hard-working, self-reliant pioneers who succeeded through divine providence and cooperation with friendly natives. It suggested that America was always destined to be a Christian nation founded on European values, and it completely erased the violence, disease, and genocide that actually characterized early colonial history. Elementary school textbooks began featuring illustrations of smiling pilgrims and grateful Indians sharing a peaceful meal. Children's plays reenacted the mythical first Thanksgiving, with students dressed in construction paper headdresses and buckled hats. Norman Rockwell's famous painting, Freedom from Want, showed a white family gathered around a turkey dinner, embodying American prosperity and traditional values. The myth became so deeply embedded in American culture that questioning it seemed unpatriotic. Meanwhile, indigenous Americans were fighting for their very survival. The federal government was still seizing their remaining lands, still separating children from families, still attempting to destroy their cultures and identities. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted citizenship to indigenous people, but it was a hollow gesture that came with no real rights or protections. Many states continued to prohibit indigenous people from voting, owning property, or practicing their religions. During the Great Depression and World War II, the Thanksgiving myth became even more important to American national identity. As the country faced economic collapse and global war, the story of pilgrims and Indians sharing a peaceful meal provided comfort and reassurance. It suggested that America had always been a place where different peoples could come together in harmony, conveniently ignoring the centuries of violence that had actually characterized relations between Europeans and indigenous Americans. The civil rights movements of the 1960s began to challenge some aspects of American historical mythology, but Thanksgiving remained largely untouched. African Americans demanded recognition of slavery's central role in American history. Mexican Americans fought for acknowledgement of the Southwest's pre-Columbian civilizations. But the Thanksgiving story was so deeply embedded in American childhood memories and family traditions that it seemed immune to criticism. That began to change in 1970, when a Wampanoag man named Frank James was invited to speak at a Massachusetts ceremony commemorating the 355th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. James had written a speech describing the true history of European colonization and its devastating impact on indigenous peoples. When Massachusetts officials read his speech in advance, they refused to let him deliver it, demanding that he substitute a more positive message that would not offend the white audience. James refused to change his speech, so he was disinvited from the ceremony. Instead, he and other indigenous activists gathered at Plymouth Rock to hold their own event, which they called a National Day of Mourning. Standing near the site where the Mayflower had landed 350 years earlier, James read his censored speech to a small crowd of supporters and journalists. His words were powerful and uncompromising. He described Thanksgiving as a reminder of the genocide of millions of native people, the theft of native lands, and the relentless assault on native culture. He explained how the holiday had been used to perpetuate myths that justified continued oppression of indigenous peoples, and he called on Americans to confront the true history of their country instead of celebrating sanitized fairy tales. The National Day of Mourning has continued every year since 1970, drawing indigenous people and allies from across the country to Plymouth on Thanksgiving Day. They gather to honor ancestors who were killed by European colonization, to remember cultures that were destroyed, and to protest the ongoing injustices faced by Indigenous communities. It's a direct challenge to the mythology that surrounds Thanksgiving, a reminder that not everyone has a reason to celebrate America's national holiday of gratitude. But the impact of the National Day of Mourning extended far beyond the annual gathering at Plymouth Rock. It inspired a new generation of Indigenous scholars, activists, and educators to research and share the true history of European colonization. They began publishing books, creating documentaries, and developing curricula that told the story from Indigenous perspectives rather than European ones. These efforts revealed the enormous scope of what had been hidden or distorted in traditional American historical narratives, the scale of pre-Columbian Indigenous civilizations, the sophistication of their political, economic, and cultural systems, the deliberate nature of European violence and land theft, the resilience and resistance of Indigenous communities in the face of genocide, the ongoing struggles of contemporary Indigenous peoples for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation. They also revealed how the Thanksgiving myth was just one example of a much larger pattern of historical distortion. American textbooks routinely described European colonization as settlement rather than invasion. They portrayed Indigenous peoples as primitive savages who benefited from contact with civilized Europeans. They depicted westward expansion as manifest destiny rather than conquest. They celebrated military leaders who committed genocide as national heroes. This wasn't accidental ignorance or innocent omission. It was deliberate propaganda designed to make Americans feel good about their country's history while avoiding uncomfortable truths about how that history was actually created. The Thanksgiving myth was particularly effective because it targeted children, embedding false narratives in their minds before they were old enough to think critically about what they were being taught. The process of creating the Thanksgiving myth reveals something disturbing about American society's relationship with truth and memory. When faced with a history that includes genocide, enslavement, and systematic violence, Americans chose to invent a more comfortable alternative. They created a story that allowed them to feel proud of their ancestors while ignoring the suffering those ancestors had caused. This wasn't just about the distant past. The construction of the Thanksgiving myth was happening simultaneously with ongoing violence against Indigenous peoples. While children were learning about friendly pilgrims and grateful Indians in school, their government was still seizing Indigenous lands, still destroying Indigenous families, still attempting to eliminate Indigenous cultures. The myth didn't just hide historical atrocities, it provided cover for contemporary ones. The deliberate nature of this myth-making becomes even clearer when you examine what was left out of the traditional Thanksgiving story. Not just the violence and disease that followed the 1621 feast, but the broader context of European colonization and its impact on Indigenous peoples. The sophisticated civilizations that existed before European contact. The complex political and economic systems that Europeans destroyed. The ongoing resistance and survival of Indigenous communities, despite centuries of attempted genocide. American education systematically erased these realities from its historical narratives, creating a version of the past that portrayed European Americans as the protagonists and Indigenous Americans as either grateful supporting characters or obstacles to progress. This wasn't education. It was indoctrination, designed to produce citizens who would never question the legitimacy of their country's foundations. The consequences of this indoctrination extend far beyond hurt feelings or wounded pride. When Americans learn false histories that portray genocide as friendship, they become incapable of understanding the ongoing impacts of colonization on Indigenous communities. They can't comprehend why Indigenous peoples continue to struggle with poverty, health disparities, and social problems when they believe these communities were helped rather than harmed by European contact. They can't understand why treaty rights and land sovereignty remain contentious issues when they've been taught that Indigenous peoples willingly shared their territory. They can't grasp why many Indigenous Americans view Thanksgiving as a day of mourning when they've been conditioned to see it as a celebration of intercultural harmony. This ignorance isn't just embarrassing, it's dangerous. It allows contemporary injustices against indigenous peoples to continue unchallenged because most Americans don't understand the historical context that created these problems. When the Dakota Access Pipeline threatened sacred indigenous sites and water supplies, millions of Americans couldn't comprehend why indigenous communities were protesting. They had never learned about the centuries of broken treaties, stolen lands, and environmental destruction that made this latest violation so significant. When indigenous women go missing and murdered at rates far higher than any other demographic, most Americans remain unaware because they've never been taught about the systematic violence that has targeted indigenous communities for centuries. The missing and murdered indigenous women crisis isn't a new phenomenon. It's the continuation of patterns of violence that began with European colonization and have never stopped. The mythology surrounding Thanksgiving actively prevents Americans from understanding these connections. By teaching children that European colonization was beneficial and peaceful, American education creates adults who can't recognize ongoing colonization when they see it. By portraying indigenous peoples as historical figures who disappeared into the past, it makes contemporary indigenous struggles invisible. But the damage goes even deeper than ignorance about current events. The Thanksgiving myth shapes how Americans think about justice, progress, and their country's role in the world. If you believe that America was founded through peaceful cooperation between different peoples, you're more likely to see American military interventions abroad as humanitarian missions rather than imperial conquests. If you think American prosperity came from hard work and divine providence rather than genocide and slavery, you're less likely to support policies that address historical injustices. The myth creates what scholars call cognitive dissonance, a psychological state where people hold contradictory beliefs without recognizing the contradiction. Americans can simultaneously believe that their country stands for freedom and equality while supporting policies that perpetuate inequality and oppression. They can celebrate diversity and inclusion while living on land that was stolen from indigenous peoples. They can honor veterans who fought for democracy while ignoring the fact that many of those veterans participated in genocidal campaigns against indigenous communities. This cognitive dissonance explains why so many Americans react with anger when confronted with the true history of Thanksgiving. They're not just defending a holiday. They're defending their entire understanding of American identity and moral legitimacy. To accept that Thanksgiving celebrates genocide would require acknowledging that everything they learned about their country's founding was false. It would mean confronting the possibility that America's prosperity and power were built on systematic violence rather than noble ideals. The resistance to historical truth becomes even more intense when you realize how deeply the Thanksgiving myth is embedded in American family traditions. For most Americans, Thanksgiving isn't just a national holiday. It's their most important family gathering of the year. It's associated with childhood memories, family recipes, and multi-generational traditions. Challenging the mythology of Thanksgiving feels like an attack on these personal and cultural foundations. But this emotional investment in the myth makes historical truth even more necessary. When Americans gather around Thanksgiving tables, they're not just sharing a meal. They're participating in a ritual that reinforces false narratives about their country's history. They're teaching their children to celebrate genocide without knowing it. They're perpetuating a cycle of ignorance and denial that has lasted for centuries. Breaking this cycle requires more than just learning alternative facts about 1621. It requires fundamentally reimagining what Thanksgiving could represent. Instead of celebrating a mythical moment of intercultural harmony, Americans could use the holiday to acknowledge the real history of European colonization and its ongoing impacts. Instead of giving thanks for their blessings while ignoring how those blessings were obtained, they could commit to addressing the injustices that made their prosperity possible. Some Americans have already begun this process of transformation. Indigenous communities have been leading efforts to decolonize Thanksgiving for decades, creating alternative ways to observe the holiday that honor truth rather than mythology. Some families have adopted practices like reading the names of massacred Indigenous peoples, donating to Indigenous-led organizations, or using the holiday as an opportunity to learn about the true history of their local area. Educational institutions have also begun to change, though slowly and often against significant resistance. Some schools now teach about the National Day of Mourning alongside traditional Thanksgiving lessons. Some universities have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Some museums have created exhibits that tell the story of European colonization from Indigenous perspectives, rather than European ones. These changes face enormous pushback from Americans who prefer comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. Politicians regularly attack educational curricula that include honest discussions of slavery, genocide, and systemic racism, claiming that teaching accurate history is somehow unpatriotic or harmful to children. They pass laws prohibiting teachers from discussing how historical injustices continue to affect contemporary society. This resistance reveals something crucial about the function of historical mythology in American society. Myths like the Thanksgiving story aren't just entertainment or cultural tradition. They're tools of social control, designed to prevent people from questioning the legitimacy of existing power structures. By teaching Americans to see their country's history as fundamentally virtuous, these myths make it difficult to advocate for fundamental changes to address ongoing injustices. The stakes of this struggle over historical memory extend far beyond academic debates about what happened in 1621. They involve the future of American democracy and the possibility of creating a more just society. As long as Americans believe false stories about their past, they'll be unable to understand their present or imagine a different future. Consider what happens when Americans learn the true history of Thanksgiving alongside the mythology they've always known. Instead of seeing their country as exceptional and morally superior, they begin to understand it as one example among many of how colonial powers have used violence and deception to build empires. Instead of viewing contemporary problems as aberrations from American ideals, they recognize them as continuations of patterns that have existed since the beginning. This shift in perspective doesn't make people hate their country. It makes them want to improve it. When you understand that American prosperity was built on genocide and slavery, you become more motivated to support policies that address the ongoing effects of these historical injustices. When you recognize that American democracy has always excluded and oppressed certain groups, you become more committed to making it truly inclusive for the first time. The process of confronting historical truth is painful, but it's also liberating. Americans who learn about the real history of Thanksgiving often describe feeling a sense of relief alongside their anger and sadness. They're relieved to finally understand why so many things about American society never made sense to them. They're relieved to discover that their discomfort with patriotic celebrations was justified. They're relieved to learn that other people share their questions about American mythology. This relief comes from escaping what psychologists call gaslighting, a form of psychological manipulation where people are made to question their own perceptions of reality. American education has been gaslighting its citizens for centuries, teaching them to ignore evidence of historical violence while celebrating mythical stories of peace and cooperation. Learning the truth about Thanksgiving is like escaping from an abusive relationship where you've been told that your concerns and observations are invalid. But escaping from historical gaslighting requires more than just learning new facts. It requires developing new ways of thinking about evidence, authority, and truth. Americans have been trained to trust official sources of information, even when those sources have obvious conflicts of interest. They've been taught to see patriotism as unquestioning loyalty, rather than critical engagement with their country's history and policies. Decolonizing Thanksgiving means learning to think independently about American history, rather than simply accepting what government institutions and corporate media tell you to believe. It means seeking out perspectives from people whose experiences have been marginalized or ignored by mainstream narratives. It means recognizing that official versions of history are often propaganda designed to serve the interests of powerful groups rather than objective accounts of what actually happened. This process of intellectual decolonization is threatening to people who benefit from the current system of historical mythology. Politicians, educators, and media figures who have built careers on promoting American exceptionalism have obvious incentives to resist efforts to teach accurate history. They understand that their authority depends partly on maintaining public ignorance about how American power was actually created and maintained. The resistance to historical truth also comes from ordinary Americans, who have emotional investments in seeing their country as fundamentally good. Many people derive meaning and identity from their connection to American mythology, and challenging these myths feels like an attack on their sense of self. Veterans who fought in wars they believed were righteous struggle to accept that those wars might have been imperial adventures rather than humanitarian missions. But this emotional resistance to historical truth ultimately hurts the people who maintain it. Americans who cling to mythical versions of their history are unable to understand why their country faces so many persistent problems. They can't comprehend why other nations view America with suspicion or hostility. They can't figure out why domestic policies that seem obviously beneficial face such intense opposition from affected communities. The mythology of Thanksgiving is particularly damaging because it shapes how Americans think about cultural diversity and inclusion. The false story teaches people to believe that different cultures can easily coexist when the dominant culture is benevolent and the minority cultures are grateful. It suggests that historical injustices can be resolved through symbolic gestures of recognition rather than substantive changes to power structures. This mythical understanding of diversity makes Americans vulnerable to superficial solutions that don't address underlying problems. They support multicultural celebrations and diversity training programs, while opposing policies that would redistribute power or resources. They celebrate Indigenous Heritage Month while ignoring ongoing violations of treaty rights. They participate in interfaith dialogue while supporting military interventions that destroy other countries. The real history of Thanksgiving offers a different model for thinking about cultural interaction and social justice. Instead of assuming that different groups will naturally cooperate when they meet, it recognizes that relationships between peoples are shaped by power dynamics, economic interests, and historical context. Instead of celebrating symbolic gestures of inclusion, it focuses on addressing the structural inequalities that create conflict and suffering. Understanding the true history of European colonization also provides insight into contemporary global politics. The same patterns of violence, deception, and resource extraction that characterize the conquest of the Americas continue to shape how wealthy nations interact with poorer ones. The same techniques of cultural destruction and psychological manipulation that were used against indigenous Americans are now deployed against populations in countries targeted for economic or military intervention. Americans who learn about the real history of Thanksgiving often begin to see connections between historical and contemporary forms of imperialism. They start to question official justifications for military interventions abroad. They become more skeptical of claims that American foreign policy is motivated by humanitarian concerns rather than economic and strategic interests. They develop what scholars call a decolonized consciousness that allows them to see through propaganda and think critically about power. This transformation in consciousness doesn't happen overnight. Breaking free from centuries of historical conditioning requires sustained effort and emotional resilience. People who begin to question American mythology often go through stages similar to grief, experiencing denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually acceptance. The process can be isolating, especially when friends and family members react defensively to challenges, to beliefs they've held their entire lives. but the process is also empowering. Americans who develop critical consciousness about their history often become more effective advocates for social justice because they understand how systems of oppression actually work. They're less likely to be fooled by symbolic gestures or cosmetic reforms. They're more committed to addressing root causes rather than symptoms of social problems. The struggle over the meaning of Thanksgiving ultimately reflects a broader battle over the soul of American society. On one side are people who want to maintain comfortable myths that justify existing power structures and avoid difficult conversations about historical injustices. On the other side are people who believe that democracy requires honest reckoning with the past and commitment to creating a more just future. This battle isn't just happening in classrooms and museums. It's playing out in state legislatures that pass laws restricting how teachers can discuss slavery and genocide. It's evident in corporate media coverage that downplays or ignores Indigenous perspectives on American history. It's visible in social media debates where people argue about whether acknowledging historical violence is somehow unpatriotic or harmful to national unity. The outcome of this struggle will determine whether Americans can develop the historical consciousness necessary to address their country's most persistent problems. Will they continue to celebrate mythical stories that prevent them from understanding how their society actually works? Or will they embrace the difficult but necessary task of confronting truth and working for justice? The choice isn't just about the past, it's about the future. Americans who cling to false histories will remain trapped in cycles of ignorance and denial that prevent them from creating positive change. Americans who embrace historical truth will be better equipped to build the inclusive democracy that their mythology claims already exists, but their reality reveals has never been achieved. The real history of Thanksgiving offers both a warning and an opportunity. The warning is that societies built on violence and deception will continue to reproduce violence and deception unless they fundamentally change their foundations. The opportunity is that acknowledging historical truth creates possibilities for transformation that didn't exist when people believed in myths. Indigenous communities have been showing Americans this path forward for decades. Despite centuries of genocide, cultural destruction, and ongoing oppression, Indigenous peoples have maintained their connections to land, culture, and each other. They've developed sophisticated analyses of how colonialism works and strategies for resistance that don't rely on violence or hatred. They've created models for sustainable relationships with the natural world that could help address the environmental crises created by industrial capitalism. Learning from Indigenous perspectives on history and politics requires more than just reading books or watching documentaries. It requires recognizing Indigenous peoples as contemporary political actors with valuable insights about how to create just societies, not just historical victims whose suffering should be remembered and mourned. It means supporting Indigenous sovereignty and land rights, not just acknowledging past injustices. This shift from sympathy to solidarity represents the difference between liberal guilt and genuine transformation. Americans who feel bad about historical injustices but don't change their behavior or support structural reforms are still participating in the systems that perpetuate those injustices. Americans who use their historical consciousness to support contemporary Indigenous struggles are beginning to break the cycles of colonialism that started with the events we now call Thanksgiving. The true meaning of Thanksgiving, then, isn't gratitude for mythical harmony between cultures. It's recognition of the ongoing struggles for justice that began when those cultures first encountered each other. It's acknowledgement of the resilience and resistance of Indigenous peoples who survived genocide and continue fighting for their rights. It's commitment to learning from Indigenous wisdom about how to live sustainably and equitably on this land. This understanding of Thanksgiving doesn't eliminate the possibility of gratitude and celebration, but it grounds those emotions in truth rather than fantasy. Instead of being grateful for blessings that came from someone else's suffering, Americans can be grateful for the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and work for justice. Instead of celebrating a mythical past, they can work to create the inclusive future that their mythology pretends already existed. The transformation from mythology to truth requires courage, but it also creates hope. When Americans stop believing that their country was founded on noble principles that were somehow corrupted by later events, they can start working to establish those principles for the first time. When they understand that democracy and equality have never been fully realized in America, they can commit to the ongoing work of creating them. This work isn't just about changing policies or institutions, though those changes are necessary. It's about changing how Americans think about themselves, their history, and their relationships with other peoples. It's about developing what Indigenous scholars call relational consciousness, and understanding that individual and community well-being are inseparable from the well-being of the land and all its inhabitants. The real history of Thanksgiving, terrible as it is, points toward this possibility of transformation. The violence and deception that characterized European colonization weren't inevitable results of cultural contact. They were choices made by people who prioritize profit and power over justice and sustainability. Different choices are possible now, but only if Americans develop the historical consciousness necessary to understand why different choices are needed. This is why the struggle over Thanksgiving matters. It's not just about correcting historical facts or making people feel guilty about the past. It's about creating the foundation for a different kind of future, one based on truth rather than mythology, justice rather than exploitation, and genuine relationships rather than domination. The children who learn the real history of Thanksgiving today will be better equipped to address the challenges their generation will face. They'll understand how systems of oppression work and how they can be changed. They'll recognize propaganda when they see it and seek out marginalized perspectives on important issues. They'll be prepared to participate in the ongoing work of decolonization that Indigenous peoples have been leading for centuries. But this transformation won't happen automatically. It requires sustained effort from people who are willing to sacrifice comfortable illusions for difficult truths. It requires supporting educators who teach accurate history despite political pressure to maintain myths. It requires seeking out and amplifying Indigenous voices that have been marginalized by mainstream media and academic institutions. Most importantly, it requires moving beyond individual consciousness to collective action. Learning about historical injustices is only the first step. The real work involves changing the systems that perpetuate those injustices and supporting the communities that continue to resist them. This means advocating for Indigenous sovereignty, supporting land-back movements, and working to address the environmental destruction that threatens all life on this planet. The mythology of Thanksgiving has shaped American consciousness for generations, but it doesn't have to continue doing so. Each person who learns the true history and shares it with others weakens the power of the myth and creates space for more honest conversations about American history and identity. Each family that changes how they observe the holiday sends a message that transformation is possible. The resistance to this transformation will be intense because the stakes are high. Powerful institutions have invested enormous resources in maintaining historical mythologies that justify their authority and prevent people from questioning fundamental assumptions about how society should be organized. They understand that historical consciousness is dangerous to their interests because it reveals how their power was obtained and suggests how it might be challenged. But the momentum for change is building. Indigenous communities are stronger and more visible than they've been in generations. Young Americans are increasingly skeptical of official narratives about their country's history and role in the world. International pressure is growing for the United States to acknowledge and address its historical and ongoing human rights violations. The question isn't whether the mythology of Thanksgiving will eventually be replaced by historical truth. The question is how long the process will take and how much suffering will continue while Americans cling to comfortable lies instead of confronting difficult realities. The path forward from this mythology isn't simple or comfortable, but it's necessary if Americans want to build a society that actually embodies the values they claim to cherish. The process begins with understanding that Thanksgiving isn't just a personal family tradition or innocent cultural celebration. It's a political act that reinforces specific narratives about American identity and legitimacy. Every November, millions of families gather around dinner tables decorated with cornucopias and turkey centerpieces, reenacting a ritual that celebrates genocide while calling it gratitude. Children dress up as pilgrims, and Indians in school plays that teach them to see colonization as friendship. Adults share what they're thankful for while sitting on land that was stolen from its original inhabitants. The entire spectacle functions as a massive exercise in collective amnesia, designed to make people forget how their prosperity was actually created. This amnesia isn't accidental. It's deliberately maintained by institutions that benefit from keeping Americans ignorant about their history. Textbook publishers sanitize historical narratives to avoid offending conservative school boards. Politicians pass laws prohibiting teachers from discussing how historical injustices continue to affect contemporary society. Corporate media ignores Indigenous perspectives on American holidays and current events. The result is a population that remains fundamentally disconnected from reality. Americans celebrate diversity while supporting policies that perpetuate inequality. They honor veterans while ignoring the fact that many of those veterans participated in genocidal campaigns. They pledge allegiance to liberty and justice for all, while living in a society that has never actually provided liberty and justice for all. Breaking through this disconnect requires more than just learning alternative facts about what happened in 1621. It requires developing entirely new frameworks for understanding American history and identity. Instead of seeing their country as exceptional and morally superior, Americans need to recognize it as one example among many of how colonial powers have used violence and deception to build empires. This shift in perspective reveals connections between historical and contemporary forms of oppression that are invisible when you believe in American mythology. The same techniques of cultural destruction that were used against Indigenous Americans are now deployed in countries targeted for economic exploitation. The same patterns of resource extraction that characterize the conquest of the Americas continue to shape global capitalism. The same justifications for violence that were used to massacre Indigenous peoples are recycled to justify military interventions abroad. Understanding these connections doesn't make people hate their country. It makes them want to transform it. When you recognize that American prosperity was built on systematic violence, you become more motivated to support policies that address the ongoing effects of historical injustices. When you understand that American democracy has always excluded certain groups, you become more committed to making it truly inclusive for the first time. The transformation process is emotionally difficult because it requires grieving the loss of comforting illusions about national identity. Many Americans experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance when confronted with evidence that contradicts their deeply held beliefs about their country's moral legitimacy. They may go through stages similar to grief, experiencing denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually acceptance. This emotional journey is often isolating because friends and family members may react defensively to challenges, to beliefs they've held their entire lives. People who begin questioning American mythology often find themselves excluded from social gatherings or accused of being unpatriotic. The pressure to conform and maintain comfortable lives can be overwhelming, especially during holiday seasons when nationalist rituals are most intense. But the process is also liberating. Americans who develop critical consciousness about their history often describe feeling relief alongside their anger and sadness. They're relieved to finally understand why so many things about American society never made sense to them. They're relieved to discover that their discomfort with patriotic celebrations was justified. They're relieved to learn that other people share their questions about American mythology. This liberation comes from escaping what amounts to a form of collective gaslighting that has shaped American consciousness for generations. Citizens have been taught to ignore evidence of systematic violence while celebrating mythical stories of peace and cooperation. They've been conditioned to see patriotism as unquestioning loyalty rather than critical engagement with their country's policies and history. Developing independence from this psychological manipulation requires learning to think critically about sources of information and authority. Americans have been trained to trust government institutions and corporate media, even when those sources have obvious conflicts of interest. They need to develop skills for seeking out marginalized perspectives and evaluating evidence independently. This intellectual decolonization process threatens people who benefit from maintaining historical mythology. Politicians, educators, and media figures who have built careers on promoting American exceptionalism understand that their authority depends partly on keeping the public ignorant about how American power was actually created. They have obvious incentives to resist efforts to teach accurate history or encourage critical thinking about national identity. The resistance also comes from ordinary citizens who derive meaning and identity from their connection to American mythology. Veterans who fought in wars they believed were righteous struggle to accept that those conflicts might have been imperial adventures rather than humanitarian missions. Religious Americans who see their country as divinely blessed have difficulty acknowledging that it was founded on genocide and slavery. These emotional investments in national mythology create psychological barriers to learning historical truth that can persist even when people are presented with overwhelming evidence. The mythology serves important psychological functions, providing meaning, identity, and moral justification for difficult life experiences. Challenging these myths feels like an attack on people's fundamental sense of self, but clinging to false histories ultimately hurts the people who maintain them. Americans who refuse to confront their country's actual past remain unable to understand why it faces so many persistent problems. They can't comprehend why other nations view America with suspicion or hostility. They can't figure out why domestic policies that seem obviously beneficial face such intense opposition from affected communities. The mythology of Thanksgiving is particularly damaging because it shapes how Americans think about cultural diversity and social justice. The false story teaches people to believe that historical injustices can be resolved through symbolic gestures of recognition rather than substantive changes to power structures. It suggests that different cultures can easily coexist when the dominant culture is benevolent and minority cultures are grateful. This superficial understanding of diversity makes Americans vulnerable to cosmetic solutions that don't address underlying problems. They support multicultural celebrations and diversity training programs while opposing policies that would redistribute power or resources. They participate in interfaith dialogue while supporting military interventions that destroy other societies. They celebrate Indigenous Heritage Month while ignoring ongoing violations of treaty rights. Contemporary Indigenous communities offer different models for thinking about justice and cultural relationships. Despite centuries of genocide and ongoing oppression, Indigenous peoples have maintained connections to land, culture, and community. They've developed sophisticated analyses of how colonialism works and strategies for resistance that don't rely on violence or hatred. They've created sustainable relationships with the natural world that could help address environmental crises created by industrial capitalism. Learning from Indigenous perspectives requires recognizing them as contemporary political actors with valuable insights about creating just societies, not just historical victims whose suffering should be remembered. It means supporting Indigenous sovereignty and land rights, not just acknowledging past injustices. It means understanding that decolonization is an ongoing process that affects everyone living on stolen land. This shift from sympathy to solidarity represents the difference between liberal guilt and genuine transformation. Americans who feel bad about historical injustices but don't change their behavior are still participating in systems that perpetuate those injustices. Americans who use their historical consciousness to support contemporary indigenous struggles begin breaking cycles of colonialism that started with European invasion. The real meaning of Thanksgiving becomes clear when understood in this context. It's not a celebration of mythical harmony between cultures. It's recognition of ongoing struggles for justice that began when those cultures first encountered each other violently. It's acknowledgement of indigenous resilience and resistance that has survived centuries of attempted extermination. It's commitment to learning from indigenous wisdom about living sustainably on this land. This understanding doesn't eliminate possibilities for gratitude and celebration, but it grounds those emotions in truth rather than fantasy. Instead of being grateful for blessings obtained through someone else's suffering, Americans can appreciate opportunities to learn from mistakes and work for justice. Instead of celebrating a mythical past, they can commit to creating the inclusive future that their mythology pretends already existed. Some families and communities have already begun transforming how they observe Thanksgiving. They read names of massacred indigenous peoples during their meals. They donate to indigenous-led organizations working for sovereignty and justice. They use the holiday as an opportunity to learn about the true history of their local area and the indigenous peoples who lived there before colonization. Educational institutions are also slowly changing, though often against significant resistance. Some schools now teach about the National Day of Mourning alongside traditional Thanksgiving lessons. Universities have begun replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Museums have created exhibits telling the story of colonization from indigenous perspectives rather than European ones. These changes face enormous pushback from Americans who prefer comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. Politicians attack educational curricula that include honest discussions of genocide and systemic racism. They pass laws restricting how teachers can discuss historical injustices and their contemporary effects. Corporate interests fund campaigns to maintain mythological narratives that prevent critical thinking about power structures. The resistance reveals how historical mythology functions as a tool of social control by teaching Americans to see their country's history as fundamentally virtuous. These myths make it difficult to advocate for changes that would address ongoing injustices. People who believe America was founded on noble principles are less likely to support policies that would redistribute wealth or challenge existing power relationships. But momentum for change is building despite institutional resistance. Indigenous communities are stronger and more visible than they've been in generations. Young Americans are increasingly skeptical of official narratives about their country's history and global role. International pressure is growing for the United States to acknowledge and address its human rights violations. Social media has also created new possibilities for sharing suppressed histories and marginalized perspectives. Information that was once controlled by gatekeepers in academic and media institutions can now be distributed directly to people hungry for truth. Indigenous educators, historians, and activists use these platforms to teach accurate history and challenge dominant narratives. The transformation of consciousness happening among growing numbers of Americans creates possibilities that didn't exist when mythological thinking was universal. People who understand how systems of oppression actually work become more effective advocates for justice. They're less likely to be fooled by symbolic gestures or superficial reforms. They focus on addressing root causes rather than symptoms of social problems. This critical consciousness also makes people more resistant to propaganda about contemporary events. Americans who understand the real history of their country's founding are more skeptical of claims that military interventions are motivated by humanitarian concerns. They recognize patterns of deception that have been used repeatedly to justify violence and exploitation. The development of historical consciousness is therefore not just an academic exercise or cultural curiosity. It's a prerequisite for democracy and justice. Societies cannot address their problems effectively when citizens believe false stories about how those problems were created. Americans cannot build inclusive communities when they think their country was always inclusive. The struggle over Thanksgiving's meaning reflects this broader battle for America's political soul. On one side are people who want to maintain comfortable myths that justify existing inequalities and prevent difficult conversations about structural change. On the other side are people who believe democracy requires honest reckoning with the past and commitment to creating justice. The outcome will determine whether Americans develop the consciousness necessary to address their society's most persistent challenges. Will they continue celebrating mythical stories that prevent them from understanding how power actually works? Or will they embrace the difficult but necessary task of confronting truth and working for transformation? Indigenous communities have been showing this path forward for decades. Their survival, despite centuries of attempted extermination, proves that resistance is possible. Their maintenance of cultural practices and political sovereignty demonstrates alternatives to the systems that created Thanksgiving's mythology. Their contemporary struggles for land rights and environmental protection offer models for justice that could benefit everyone. Supporting these struggles requires more than sympathy or cultural appreciation. It means advocating for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. It means opposing projects that threaten Indigenous lands and resources. It means recognizing that environmental destruction and social injustice are connected problems that require systemic solutions. The climate crisis makes this work even more urgent. The same worldview that justified genocide against Indigenous peoples drives the destruction of ecosystems that sustain all life. The same economic system that built wealth through slavery and land theft now threatens planetary survival through endless growth and consumption. Indigenous knowledge systems offer alternatives based on sustainable relationships with the natural world. But accessing this wisdom requires dismantling the colonial structures that have suppressed it for centuries. It means recognizing Indigenous peoples as teachers rather than subjects of study. It means supporting their efforts to reclaim land and practice traditional ways of life. The transformation from mythology to truth creates possibilities for addressing multiple crises simultaneously. Climate change, economic inequality, racial injustice, and political polarization are all connected to the same colonial systems that created Thanksgiving's false narrative. Understanding these connections reveals opportunities for solutions that address root causes rather than symptoms. This work cannot be accomplished by individuals acting alone. It requires collective action to change institutions and systems that perpetuate injustice. It means supporting political candidates who advocate for Indigenous rights and environmental protection. It means pressuring educational institutions to teach accurate history. It means boycotting corporations that profit from environmental destruction and cultural appropriation. The resistance will be fierce because the stakes are enormous. Powerful interests have invested tremendous resources in maintaining mythologies that justify their authority and prevent systemic change. They understand that historical consciousness threatens their power because it reveals how that power was obtained and suggests how it might be challenged. But the alternative to confronting this truth is continuation of the cycles of violence and destruction that have characterized American society since its founding. The mythology that celebrates genocide while calling it gratitude cannot provide foundation for justice or sustainability. The lies that justify inequality and exploitation cannot create democracy or community. The choice facing Americans is ultimately between comfort and transformation. They can continue believing pleasant stories about their past while their society collapses around them. Or they can embrace the difficult work of learning truth and building something better on foundations of honesty and justice. The real history of Thanksgiving offers both warning and hope. The warning is that societies built on violence and deception will continue reproducing those patterns unless they fundamentally change their foundations. The hope is that acknowledging truth creates possibilities for transformation that don't exist when people believe in myths. Children who learn accurate history today will be better equipped to address challenges their generation faces. They'll understand how oppression works and how it can be challenged. They'll recognize propaganda and seek out marginalized perspectives. They'll be prepared for the ongoing work of decolonization that Indigenous peoples have been leading. This transformation won't happen automatically. It requires sustained effort from people willing to sacrifice comfortable illusions for difficult truths. It requires courage to face resistance from family, friends, and institutions invested in maintaining mythology. It requires commitment to learning from Indigenous teachers and supporting their struggles for justice. But the momentum is building. Each person who learns the real history and shares it weakens the power of mythology and creates space for honest conversation. Each family that changes how they observe the holiday sends a message that transformation is possible. Each community that supports Indigenous sovereignty takes a step toward decolonization. The mythology of Thanksgiving has shaped American consciousness for generations, but it doesn't have to continue doing so. The true history has always existed, preserved by Indigenous communities, despite centuries of suppression. Now it's becoming impossible to ignore as more people seek truth and justice. The question isn't whether the mythology will eventually be replaced by historical fact. The question is how long the process will take and how much suffering will continue while Americans choose comfortable lies over difficult realities. The answer depends on whether enough people are willing to do the hard work of confronting truth and building justice on its foundation. The time for mythology has passed. The time for truth has come. What Americans do with that truth will determine not just their own future, but the future of all peoples sharing this land and this planet. The choice between celebration and mourning, between gratitude and justice, between mythology and reality remains theirs to make, ours to make. The children gathered around school lunch tables in November have no idea they're celebrating mass murder. They trade turkey-shaped cookies and construction paper headdresses while their teachers smile and nod, perpetuating a lie so deeply embedded in American culture that questioning it feels like heresy. But this isn't just about one holiday or one historical event. This is about how an entire civilization learns to normalize genocide by wrapping it in the language of gratitude. The transformation of Thanksgiving from a celebration of massacre into America's most sacred family tradition required generations of careful manipulation. It didn't happen by accident. Writers, politicians, educators, and religious leaders worked systematically to create a mythology that would make Americans feel good about their history while erasing the voices of those who suffered to create it. And they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. By the 1950s, Norman Rockwell's painting Freedom from Want had crystallized the Thanksgiving myth into its most powerful form. A smiling white family gathered around a golden turkey representing American prosperity and traditional values. The image appeared in magazines, on calendars, in advertisements, and eventually in classrooms across the country. It became the visual shorthand for what Thanksgiving was supposed to represent: abundance, gratitude, family unity, and American exceptionalism, all wrapped into one perfect moment. But look closer at that painting. Notice who's missing. There are no Indigenous people at that table. No acknowledgement of whose land that house sits on. No recognition of how that prosperity was obtained. The Native Americans who supposedly shared that first feast have been completely erased from their own story. They've become invisible, relegated to the distant past, as if they simply vanished after 1621 instead of enduring centuries of systematic extermination. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was the culmination of a deliberate campaign to transform Indigenous peoples from contemporary political actors into historical museum pieces. By the mid-20th century, most Americans believed that Native Americans were extinct, a tragic but inevitable casualty of progress. They had no idea that indigenous communities were still fighting for survival, still resisting colonization, still maintaining their cultures despite everything that had been done to destroy them. The mythology became so powerful that it shaped how Americans understood not just Thanksgiving, but their entire relationship with indigenous peoples. When they thought about Native Americans at all, they imagined noble savages from a romanticized past, not real people with real grievances about ongoing injustices. This allowed them to feel a vague sense of sadness about historical tragedies while avoiding any responsibility for contemporary problems. Meanwhile, the federal government was completing the work that colonial militias had started 3 centuries earlier. The Indian termination policy of the 1950s and 1960s attempted to eliminate tribal sovereignty and force indigenous peoples to assimilate into mainstream American society. Reservations were dissolved, treaty rights were violated, and children were removed from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. This wasn't ancient history happening in some distant past. This was occurring while American families were gathering around Thanksgiving tables to celebrate the mythical harmony between Pilgrims and Indians. Children who dressed up as friendly natives in school plays were growing up in a country that was actively destroying real native communities. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but the mythology was so deeply embedded that most people never noticed the contradiction. The boarding school system represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of American genocide against indigenous peoples. From the 1870s through the 1970s, hundreds of thousands of indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to institutions designed to erase their cultural identities. The motto of these schools was, "Kill the Indian, save the man," and they pursued this goal with systematic brutality. Children arrived at these schools speaking their native languages, practicing their traditional religions, and maintaining connections to their tribal identities. They were immediately stripped of everything that marked them as indigenous. Their hair was cut, their clothes were burned, their names were changed to English equivalents. They were beaten for speaking their native languages, punished for practicing their traditional ceremonies, and subjected to sexual and physical abuse on a massive scale. The psychological trauma inflicted by these schools lasted for generations. Children who survived returned to their communities unable to speak their native languages or connect with their cultural traditions. They suffered from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but had no framework for understanding or treating their symptoms. Many turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain. Others committed suicide. Some became abusive themselves, perpetuating cycles of violence and trauma. The boarding school system was explicitly designed to break the transmission of indigenous cultures from one generation to the next. By separating children from their families and communities during crucial developmental years, the government could ensure that traditional knowledge, languages, and spiritual practices would die out. It was cultural genocide carried out with the efficiency of an industrial process. This was happening while Americans celebrated Thanksgiving as a holiday of intercultural friendship and gratitude. The same government that proclaimed November as a month for giving thanks was simultaneously running institutions dedicated to destroying indigenous cultures. The same society that taught children about Pilgrims and Indians sharing a peaceful meal was forcibly separating indigenous children from their families and subjecting them to systematic abuse. The residential school system in Canada operated on the same principles and achieved similar results. An estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend these institutions, and at least 6,000 died from disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Mass graves containing the remains of children who never made it home have been discovered at former school sites across the country, providing physical evidence of the genocide that Thanksgiving mythology was designed to hide. These discoveries have sparked a reckoning with historical truth that Thanksgiving celebrations have long avoided. Indigenous communities that had maintained oral histories about missing children and unmarked graves finally had their testimonies validated by archaeological evidence. The world was forced to confront the reality that the boarding school system was not an educational program, but a mechanism of extermination. Yet even as these revelations made international headlines, many Americans continued celebrating Thanksgiving as if nothing had changed. They expressed shock and sadness about residential schools in Canada, while remaining ignorant about identical institutions that had operated in their own country. They shared social media posts about missing Indigenous children while planning their annual feast to commemorate Pilgrim Indian friendship. This selective awareness reveals how powerfully the Thanksgiving mythology shapes American consciousness. People can absorb information about historical atrocities while maintaining emotional investment in celebrating the very systems that perpetrated those atrocities. The holiday has become so central to American identity that challenging it feels like an attack on family, tradition, and national belonging. The resistance to truth becomes even more intense when you understand how deeply Thanksgiving is embedded in American economic and social structures. The holiday marks the beginning of the Christmas shopping season, generating billions of dollars in retail sales. Television networks build their programming schedules around Thanksgiving specials and football games. Airlines and hotels depend on Thanksgiving travel for their annual profits. Millions of jobs are tied to industries that profit from maintaining the mythology. Food companies spend millions of dollars on advertising campaigns that reinforce traditional Thanksgiving imagery. Butterball turkey, ocean spray cranberries, and stovetop stuffing have all built their brands around nostalgic depictions of Pilgrim-era feasts. Grocery stores create elaborate displays featuring cornucopias and harvest themes that perpetuate the mythology while driving consumer spending. The entertainment industry has also invested heavily in maintaining Thanksgiving mythology. Countless movies, television shows, and children's books depict the holiday as a celebration of family values and American traditions. Disney's animated features, Peanuts holiday specials, and Norman Rockwell-inspired commercials all reinforce the same basic narrative about grateful pilgrims and helpful Indians sharing a harmonious meal. These cultural products don't just reflect American values. They actively shape them, especially for children who absorb these messages during their most formative years. When young people see the same mythology repeated across multiple forms of media, it becomes extremely difficult for them to question its accuracy later in life. The stories feel like fundamental truths, rather than constructed narratives designed to serve particular political and economic interests. The mythology has also become central to American religious identity, particularly among white evangelical Christians who see the Pilgrims as spiritual ancestors and Thanksgiving as a holy day. Churches across the country hold special services in November that blend patriotic and religious themes, celebrating America as a Christian nation blessed by divine providence. These services often include prayers of gratitude for religious freedom and constitutional protections, conveniently ignoring the fact that these same freedoms were denied to Indigenous peoples. Religious leaders use Thanksgiving sermons to reinforce the mythology while advancing contemporary political agendas. They celebrate the Pilgrims as refugees seeking religious liberty while opposing immigration policies that would help modern refugees. They praise America as a beacon of freedom while supporting politicians who restrict voting rights and civil liberties. They give thanks for God's blessings while advocating for policies that increase inequality and environmental destruction. This fusion of religious and patriotic mythology makes Thanksgiving particularly resistant to historical criticism. Challenging the accuracy of Thanksgiving stories feels like attacking both faith and country simultaneously. People who might otherwise be open to learning new historical facts become defensive when they perceive threats to beliefs that provide meaning and identity. The mythology has also become entangled with family memories and personal traditions that span multiple generations. Grandparents who lived through the Great Depression and World War II often see Thanksgiving as a symbol of American resilience and prosperity. They remember times when food was scarce and families were separated, making the abundance of Thanksgiving dinner feel like a genuine miracle worth celebrating. Children and grandchildren inherit these emotional associations, along with family recipes and holiday rituals. The smell of roasting turkey becomes linked to memories of loved ones who have passed away. Traditional dishes carry stories about family history and cultural heritage. Challenging the mythology of Thanksgiving feels like dishonoring ancestors and destroying precious family connections. But this emotional resistance to truth ultimately dishonors the real ancestors whose suffering made contemporary prosperity possible. Indigenous families who were torn apart by boarding schools, massacred by military forces, and displaced from their ancestral lands deserve to have their experiences acknowledged rather than erased by comfortable myths. Honoring genuine history requires confronting difficult truths, not perpetuating pleasant lies. The process of decolonizing Thanksgiving doesn't require eliminating gratitude or family gatherings. It requires grounding these practices in truth rather than mythology. Families can express appreciation for their blessings while acknowledging how those blessings were obtained. They can maintain traditions while educating themselves about the real history of the land they live on. They can honor their ancestors while recognizing the ancestors of others who suffered to make their prosperity possible. Some communities have already begun this transformation. Indigenous educators work with schools to develop curricula that teach accurate history alongside traditional Thanksgiving lessons. Museums create exhibits that present multiple perspectives on colonial history rather than just European viewpoints. Religious congregations incorporate Indigenous prayers and perspectives into their Thanksgiving services while learning about contemporary Native struggles. These efforts face significant resistance from people who benefit from maintaining the mythology. School boards reject textbooks that include honest discussions of genocide and colonization. Politicians pass laws prohibiting teachers from discussing how historical injustices affect contemporary society. Corporate interests fund campaigns to preserve traditional narratives that prevent critical thinking about power structures and systemic inequality. The resistance reveals how historical mythology functions as a tool of social control. By teaching Americans to see their country's past as fundamentally virtuous, these myths make it difficult to advocate for changes that would address ongoing injustices. People who believe America was founded on noble principles are less likely to support policies that would redistribute wealth, expand democratic participation, or challenge existing power relationships. But maintaining these myths becomes increasingly difficult as information becomes more accessible and marginalized voices gain platforms to share their perspectives. Social media allows Indigenous educators and activists to reach audiences that were once controlled by gatekeepers in academic and media institutions. International attention to Indigenous rights creates pressure for governments to acknowledge historical injustices and contemporary violations. The growing movement for Indigenous sovereignty and land rights also challenges the assumptions underlying Thanksgiving mythology. When Native communities assert their treaty rights and demand return of stolen lands, they force Americans to confront the ongoing impacts of colonization, rather than treating it as ancient history. When they protect sacred sites from development and resource extraction, they demonstrate alternative relationships with land that challenge the foundations of industrial capitalism. Climate change makes these Indigenous perspectives increasingly relevant to everyone's survival. The same worldview that justified genocide against Native peoples drives the destruction of ecosystems that sustain all life on Earth. The same economic system that built wealth through slavery and land theft now threatens planetary survival through endless growth and consumption of finite resources. Indigenous knowledge systems offer alternatives based on sustainable relationships with the natural world, but accessing this wisdom requires dismantling the colonial structures that have suppressed it for centuries. It means recognizing Indigenous peoples as teachers rather than subjects of study. It means supporting their efforts to reclaim land and practice traditional ways of life. It means understanding that environmental justice and social justice are inseparable struggles. This connection between historical consciousness and contemporary survival makes the struggle over Thanksgiving's meaning even more urgent. Americans cannot address climate change effectively while celebrating mythologies that justify the destruction of indigenous communities and ecosystems. They cannot build sustainable societies while maintaining economic systems based on endless extraction and exploitation. The transformation from mythology to reality requires not just individual consciousness change, but collective action to transform institutions and systems. It means supporting political candidates who advocate for indigenous rights and environmental protection. It means pressuring educational institutions to teach accurate history and critical thinking skills. It means boycotting corporations that profit from cultural appropriation and environmental destruction. The resistance will intensify as more people recognize the connections between historical injustices and contemporary crises. Powerful interests have invested enormous resources in maintaining mythologies that justify their authority and prevent systemic change. They understand that historical consciousness threatens their power because it reveals how that power was obtained and suggests how it might be challenged. But the alternative to confronting these truths is the continuation of cycles of violence and destruction that have characterized American society since its founding. The mythology that celebrates genocide while calling it gratitude cannot provide a foundation for justice or sustainability. The lies that justify inequality and exploitation cannot create genuine democracy or community. Young people increasingly understand these connections and demand honest education about their country's history. They refuse to celebrate holidays that whitewash genocide or pledge allegiance to flags that represent oppression. They seek out indigenous perspectives on history and contemporary issues. They organize protests against pipelines that threaten sacred sites and demand divestment from industries that destroy indigenous communities. This generational shift in consciousness creates possibilities that didn't exist when mythological thinking was universal among white Americans. Young people who understand how systems of oppression work become more effective advocates for justice. They're less susceptible to propaganda about American exceptionalism and more committed to building inclusive societies based on truth rather than comfortable lies. Educational institutions are slowly responding to these demands, though often against significant resistance from conservative politicians and donors. Some universities have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day and created Native American studies programs that center Indigenous perspectives. Some K-12 schools now teach about boarding schools, broken treaties, and ongoing Indigenous struggles alongside traditional historical narratives. These changes face enormous pushback from Americans who prefer mythology to reality. Politicians attack curricula that include honest discussions of genocide and systemic racism, claiming that accurate history somehow damages children's self-esteem or national unity. They pass laws restricting how teachers can discuss historical injustices and their contemporary effects. Corporate media generally ignores or minimizes Indigenous perspectives on American holidays and current events. When they do cover Indigenous issues, they often frame them as historical curiosities, rather than contemporary political struggles. They rarely explain connections between past injustices and present inequalities, maintaining the illusion that historical problems have been resolved. Religious institutions remain largely committed to mythological interpretations of American history that support their theological and political agendas. Many churches continue holding Thanksgiving services that celebrate America as a Christian nation, blessed by divine providence, ignoring the violence and exploitation that created American prosperity. But cracks are appearing in these institutional walls of resistance. Indigenous voices are becoming harder to ignore as they gain access to new platforms and international support. Historical evidence keeps mounting that contradicts comfortable myths about American origins and development. Environmental crises force recognition that indigenous knowledge systems offer essential wisdom for planetary survival. The momentum for change is building despite institutional resistance, but transformation won't happen automatically. It requires sustained effort from people willing to sacrifice comfortable illusions for difficult truths. It requires courage to face hostility from family, friends, and institutions invested in maintaining mythology. It requires commitment to learning from indigenous teachers and supporting their struggles for justice. The choice facing Americans is ultimately between comfort and transformation, between celebrating pleasant lies or confronting harsh realities. They can continue gathering around Thanksgiving tables to give thanks for blessings obtained through genocide, or they can begin the difficult work of building justice on foundations of truth. The children who learn accurate history today will inherit a world shaped by the choices their elders make about mythology versus reality. Will they receive education that prepares them to address the multiple crises facing humanity, or will they be indoctrinated with comfortable lies that prevent them from understanding how those crises were created? Will they learn to think critically about power and privilege, or will they be taught to accept authority without question? Will they develop consciousness about how systems of oppression work, or will they remain trapped in cycles of ignorance that perpetuate injustice? The answers to these questions will determine not just the future of American society, but the survival of indigenous communities, the health of planetary ecosystems, and the possibility of justice for all peoples sharing this land. The stakes could not be higher, and the time for choosing has arrived. Every November, millions of families have an opportunity to break cycles of mythological thinking that have persisted for generations. Every classroom where children learn about Thanksgiving offers a chance to plant seeds of historical consciousness that could grow into movements for justice. Every individual who chooses truth over comfort contributes to collective transformation. The mythology of Thanksgiving has shaped American consciousness for centuries, but it doesn't have to continue doing so. The true history has always existed, preserved by indigenous communities despite systematic attempts at suppression. Now it's becoming impossible to ignore as more people seek authentic understanding of their country's past and present. The question isn't whether mythology will eventually yield to reality. The question is how much suffering will continue while Americans choose pleasant lies over difficult truths, and whether transformation will come in time to prevent the complete collapse of systems that sustain life on Earth. The real history of Thanksgiving offers both warning and possibility. The warning is that societies built on violence and deception will continue reproducing those patterns unless they fundamentally change their foundations. The possibility is that acknowledging truth creates opportunities for building something better, based on justice, sustainability, and genuine respect for all peoples and the land that sustains them. The choice between mythology and reality, between celebration and mourning, between gratitude and justice, remains before every American who sits down to Thanksgiving dinner. What they choose will echo through generations yet to come, determining whether those future generations inherit a world built on truth or one consumed by the lies their ancestors refused to abandon. The time for comfortable myths has passed. The time for uncomfortable truths has arrived. Whether Americans have the courage to embrace that truth and build justice on its foundation will determine not just their own future, but the future of all life on this planet. The choice is theirs, and the consequences will be everyone's to bear. The mythology runs so deep that most Americans can't even imagine Thanksgiving without it. Walk into any grocery store in November and you'll see the same imagery repeated endlessly. Smiling pilgrims in black hats, friendly Indians with feathered headbands, cornucopias overflowing with harvest bounty, turkey centerpieces, and autumn leaves scattered across promotional displays. Every single image reinforces the same false narrative that has been carefully constructed over generations. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. The people creating these displays, the teachers planning classroom activities, the parents buying construction paper for school projects, most of them genuinely believe they're celebrating something beautiful. They think they're honouring tradition, teaching gratitude, bringing families together. They have no idea they're participating in the largest ongoing propaganda campaign in American history. This isn't their fault. They're victims of the same system that created the mythology in the first place. They learned these stories as children, just like their parents and grandparents before them. The lies have been passed down through generations like treasured family heirlooms, each telling making them feel more precious and unquestionable. Consider how this works in practice. A kindergarten teacher plans a Thanksgiving unit because it's required by her curriculum. She's a good person who wants to teach her students about gratitude and cultural diversity, so she reads them books about pilgrims and Indians becoming friends. She has them make paper headdresses and pilgrim hats. She organises a classroom feast where children dress up and act out the mythical first Thanksgiving. The children love it. They're learning about sharing and friendship and being thankful for what they have. The parents think it's adorable when their 5-year-old comes home wearing a construction paper feather and talking about how the nice Indians helped the pilgrims. Everyone feels good about the whole experience. But what's actually happening is that 25 young minds are being programmed to accept genocide as friendship. They're learning that colonization was beneficial to indigenous peoples. They're absorbing the message that America was founded on cooperation rather than violence. And they're developing emotional attachments to these false narratives that will make them extremely resistant to learning the truth later in life. This programming is reinforced everywhere they turn. The books in their school library repeat the same stories. The television specials they watch in November feature the same characters and themes. The decorations in their homes and communities echo the same imagery. By the time they reach high school, the mythology feels like established fact rather than constructed fiction. Even when they encounter contradictory information, the emotional investment in the myth makes it nearly impossible to absorb. A teenager who learns about King Philip's War in AP history class might memorize the facts for a test, but they don't integrate this knowledge with their understanding of Thanksgiving. The massacre of indigenous peoples remains separate from the holiday they've celebrated with their family since birth. This compartmentalization allows Americans to hold completely contradictory beliefs without experiencing cognitive dissonance. They can acknowledge that terrible things happened to Native Americans while continuing to celebrate holidays that commemorate those terrible things. They can express sympathy for historical injustices while participating in rituals that perpetuate those injustices. The psychological mechanisms that make this possible are the same ones that allow people to function in other systems built on violence and exploitation. Workers can labour for corporations that destroy the environment while caring deeply about their children's future. Citizens can pay taxes that fund military interventions while considering themselves peaceful people. Consumers can buy products made by enslaved workers while opposing human trafficking. These contradictions persist because the systems that create them also create the narratives that justify them. Just as Thanksgiving mythology makes genocide feel like friendship, corporate propaganda makes environmental destruction feel like progress, and government messaging makes imperial wars feel like humanitarian interventions. Understanding how Thanksgiving mythology works, therefore, provides insight into how all forms of propaganda operate. The most effective lies aren't obvious falsehoods that people can easily reject. They're stories that feel emotionally satisfying, that confirm what people want to believe about themselves and their communities. They're myths that provide meaning and identity while obscuring uncomfortable realities. The Thanksgiving myth is particularly effective because it targets fundamental human needs for belonging, purpose, and moral coherence. People want to believe they come from good families, good communities, good countries. They want their traditions to reflect positive values. They want their ancestors to have been heroic rather than villainous. The myth provides all of this while requiring nothing in return, except willful ignorance about historical facts. But this willful ignorance comes at an enormous cost, not just to indigenous communities who continue suffering from its effects, but to all Americans who remain trapped in cycles of mythological thinking that prevent them from understanding their world. When you believe false stories about your past, you can't accurately assess your present or effectively plan for your future. Consider how Thanksgiving mythology shapes American foreign policy. If you believe your country was founded through peaceful cooperation between different cultures, you're more likely to see military interventions as humanitarian missions rather than imperial conquests. If you think American prosperity came from hard work and divine blessing rather than genocide and slavery, you're less likely to question why other countries resist American influence. The same mythological thinking that celebrates pilgrims and Indians sharing a peaceful meal allows Americans to believe their military is bringing democracy and freedom to countries they invade. The same narrative structure that erases indigenous resistance to colonization makes it easy to ignore resistance to contemporary American imperialism. When government officials claim they're intervening in other countries to protect human rights or spread democracy, they're using the same rhetorical strategies that transformed massacre celebrations into gratitude holidays. They're reframing violence as benevolence, conquest as liberation, exploitation as assistance. Americans who have been conditioned to accept these narrative reversals through Thanksgiving mythology become susceptible to similar manipulation about contemporary events. They can watch their government destroy countries while believing it's helping them. They can see evidence of war crimes while maintaining faith in American righteousness. This isn't stupidity or moral failure. It's the predictable result of lifelong exposure to propaganda that trains people to prioritize emotional comfort over factual accuracy. When your foundational stories about national identity are myths, you lose the ability to distinguish between myth and reality in other contexts. The mythology also shapes how Americans understand domestic politics and social issues. If you believe America was always a land of opportunity where different groups could succeed through cooperation and hard work, you're less likely to support policies that address structural inequalities. If you think historical injustices were aberrations from American ideals rather than expressions of them, you're more resistant to systemic reforms. The Thanksgiving narrative teaches Americans that problems between different groups can be resolved through goodwill and mutual understanding rather than changes to power structures. This makes them vulnerable to superficial solutions that don't address root causes of inequality and injustice. When politicians propose diversity training instead of wealth redistribution or cultural sensitivity workshops instead of reparations, they're drawing on the same mythology that suggests symbolic gestures of inclusion can substitute for substantive changes to systems of oppression. The Thanksgiving story provides the template for this kind of thinking by portraying genocide as a friendship that just needed better communication. Americans who believe this template often respond to contemporary racial conflicts by calling for more dialogue and understanding rather than addressing the economic and political structures that create and maintain inequality. They think police brutality can be solved through community relations programs rather than fundamental changes to law enforcement. They believe educational disparities can be addressed through cultural celebrations rather than equitable funding and resources. This focus on individual attitudes rather than systemic structures allows injustices to continue while making people feel like they're working for positive change. It's the perfect form of social control because it channels potentially revolutionary energy into harmless activities that don't threaten existing power arrangements. The same dynamic operates in environmental politics. Americans who believe their country has a special relationship with the natural world because of mythical indigenous partnerships are more likely to support symbolic environmental gestures rather than policies that would fundamentally challenge industrial capitalism. They think climate change can be addressed through individual consumer choices rather than systemic transformation of energy and economic systems. This individualistic approach to collective problems flows directly from Thanksgiving mythology that portrays historical change as the result of personal relationships rather than political and economic forces. The myth suggests that pilgrims and Indians overcame their differences through mutual respect and cooperation, erasing the reality that their relationship was determined by power imbalances, resource competition, and imperial expansion. When Americans apply this framework to contemporary issues, they focus on changing hearts and minds rather than changing laws and institutions. They think racism can be eliminated through education about tolerance rather than redistribution of wealth and power. They believe environmental destruction can be stopped through appeals to corporate responsibility rather than regulation and public ownership. These approaches consistently fail because they don't address the structural forces that create the problems they're trying to solve. But the mythology makes it difficult for Americans to understand why their well-intentioned efforts don't succeed. They keep trying the same strategies while expecting different results, trapped in patterns of thinking that prevent them from seeing alternatives. The mythology also creates enormous resistance to learning from indigenous communities who have maintained alternative approaches to these challenges for centuries. If you believe indigenous peoples were primitive societies that benefited from European contact, you're unlikely to consider indigenous knowledge systems as sources of wisdom for contemporary problems. This dismissal of indigenous perspectives deprives Americans of access to sophisticated understandings of sustainable economics, ecological relationships, and social organization that could help address multiple crises simultaneously. Indigenous communities have developed practices for living in harmony with natural systems, making decisions collectively, and maintaining cultural continuity across generations despite extreme pressure to assimilate. But accessing this knowledge requires recognizing indigenous peoples as teachers rather than historical curiosities. It means acknowledging that colonization was destructive rather than beneficial. It means understanding that indigenous sovereignty and land rights are prerequisites for environmental and social justice rather than obstacles to progress. The Thanksgiving mythology makes these recognitions nearly impossible for most Americans because it inverts the actual relationships between colonizers and colonized, presenting victims as beneficiaries and destroyers as benefactors. This inversion doesn't just distort historical understanding, it prevents contemporary learning and collaboration that could benefit everyone. Climate scientists increasingly recognize that indigenous communities protect biodiversity more effectively than government agencies or private conservation organizations. Indigenous managed lands contain 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, despite comprising less than 25% of global territory. Indigenous agricultural practices maintain genetic diversity in food crops, while industrial agriculture creates dangerous monocultures. But American environmental movements often ignore or marginalize indigenous leadership in these areas because they've been trained to see indigenous peoples as noble but primitive figures from the past rather than sophisticated contemporary actors with essential expertise for planetary survival. This marginalization reflects the same colonial mindset that created Thanksgiving mythology in the first place. It assumes that European-derived knowledge systems are inherently superior to indigenous ones, even when evidence clearly demonstrates the opposite. It prioritizes technological solutions over ecological wisdom, individual innovation over collective knowledge, profit-driven approaches over sustainable practices. Breaking free from these patterns requires more than just learning new facts about what happened in 1621. It requires developing entirely different frameworks for understanding relationships between peoples, between humans and nature, between past and present. It means recognizing that the same worldview that justified genocide against indigenous peoples continues driving destruction of ecosystems that sustain all life. The fossil fuel companies that fund climate denial campaigns use the same narrative strategies that transformed massacre celebrations into gratitude holidays. They reframe environmental destruction as economic development, corporate profit as public benefit, short-term extraction as long-term prosperity. They fund politicians and media figures who repeat these narratives while suppressing information that contradicts them. Americans who have been conditioned to accept mythological thinking through Thanksgiving celebrations become easy targets for this kind of propaganda. They've already learned to prioritize emotional comfort over factual accuracy, to trust authority figures over their own observations, to celebrate systems that harm them while calling it blessing. The connections between historical and contemporary propaganda become clear when you understand that many of the same institutions created both. Universities that developed curricula celebrating American expansion also trained the scientists and economists who justify environmental destruction. Corporations that profited from westward conquest evolved into companies that extract fossil fuels from indigenous lands. Government agencies that implemented genocide continue violating indigenous sovereignty to access natural resources. These aren't separate problems requiring separate solutions. They're manifestations of the same colonial system that began with European invasion and continues through contemporary forms of extraction and exploitation. Understanding this continuity reveals opportunities for building movements that address multiple injustices simultaneously. Indigenous communities have been leading this work for decades, connecting struggles for land rights with environmental protection, cultural preservation with climate action, sovereignty with social justice. Their organizing provides models for building coalitions that can challenge the root causes of interconnected crises rather than just addressing symptoms. But supporting these movements requires abandoning the mythological thinking that Thanksgiving celebrations reinforce every November. It means recognizing that Indigenous peoples are leading fights for everyone's survival, not just their own. It means understanding that their victories against pipelines and mining companies benefit all communities threatened by environmental destruction. This recognition transforms how Americans might approach Thanksgiving and other holidays that celebrate colonial mythology. Instead of gathering to give thanks for blessings obtained through genocide, families could use these occasions to learn about Indigenous struggles and support Indigenous-led organizations. Instead of teaching children to celebrate cultural harmony that never existed, educators could help them understand how different groups actually relate to each other in systems of power and resistance. These changes don't require eliminating gratitude or family gatherings. They require grounding these practices in reality rather than mythology. Families can express appreciation for their relationships and opportunities while acknowledging how those opportunities were created. They can maintain traditions while educating themselves about the true history of the land they live on. Some communities have already begun this transformation, creating alternative ways to observe November that honor truth rather than perpetuate lies. They organize teach-ins about Indigenous history and contemporary struggles. They host fundraisers for Indigenous-led organizations, fighting for land rights and environmental protection. They use social media to amplify Indigenous voices rather than colonial narratives. Educational institutions are slowly responding to pressure for more accurate and inclusive curricula, though progress remains limited by political resistance and institutional inertia. Some schools now include Indigenous perspectives in their Thanksgiving lessons, while others have eliminated the holiday entirely from their academic calendars. These changes face fierce opposition from Americans who benefit from maintaining mythological thinking. Politicians pass laws restricting how teachers can discuss historical injustices and their contemporary impacts. Corporate interests fund campaigns to preserve traditional narratives that prevent critical analysis of power structures. Religious leaders use sermons to reinforce mythological interpretations of American history that support their theological and political agendas. The resistance reveals how deeply Thanksgiving mythology is embedded in American identity, and how threatening accurate history feels to people who have built their worldviews on comfortable lies. Challenging the holiday feels like attacking family traditions, religious beliefs, and patriotic values all at once. But maintaining these lies ultimately threatens everything Americans claim to value. Democracy cannot function when citizens believe false stories about how their political system developed. Environmental protection is impossible when people celebrate holidays that justify the destruction of indigenous communities and ecosystems. Social justice remains unachievable when foundational narratives erase the experiences of oppressed groups. The choice facing Americans is therefore not between tradition and change, but between myths that enable destruction and truths that could enable healing. The mythology of Thanksgiving has served its purpose of making Americans feel comfortable with genocide and colonization. But comfort built on lies cannot provide the foundation for addressing the crises that mythology helped create. The real history of Thanksgiving offers different possibilities based on acknowledging harm, learning from resistance, and building relationships based on truth rather than fantasy. It suggests that transformation is possible when people have the courage to confront uncomfortable realities and work together for justice. Indigenous communities have maintained this hope through centuries of attempted extermination. Their survival proves that resistance is possible even against overwhelming odds. Their contemporary struggles for sovereignty and environmental protection offer pathways toward futures that could benefit everyone sharing this land. But realizing these possibilities requires Americans to finally choose truth over comfort, justice over mythology, genuine relationship over colonial fantasy. The time for half measures and symbolic gestures has passed. The crises facing humanity demand fundamental transformation of the systems that Thanksgiving mythology was designed to protect. Every November, millions of families have an opportunity to begin this transformation by changing how they observe the holiday. Every classroom where children learn about Thanksgiving offers a chance to plant seeds of historical consciousness that could grow into movements for justice. Every individual who chooses accuracy over mythology contributes to collective awakening. The mythology has shaped American consciousness for generations, but it doesn't have to continue doing so. The true history has always existed, preserved by indigenous communities despite systematic suppression. Now, it's becoming impossible to ignore as more people recognize connections between historical and contemporary injustices. The question isn't whether mythology will eventually yield to reality. The question is whether transformation will come quickly enough to prevent irreversible damage to the ecosystems and communities that sustain life on this planet. The answer depends on whether enough Americans are willing to sacrifice comfortable lies for the difficult work of building justice on foundations of truth. The choice between celebrating genocide and mourning it, between perpetuating mythology and embracing reality, between comfort and transformation, remains before everyone who participates in American culture. What they choose will determine not just their own future, but the future of indigenous communities, planetary ecosystems, and all peoples struggling for justice in a world shaped by centuries of colonization. The real history of Thanksgiving offers both warning and hope. The warning is that societies built on lies will continue reproducing the violence those lies were created to justify. The hope is that acknowledging truth creates possibilities for building something better, based on relationships of respect rather than domination. The time for choosing has arrived. Whether Americans have the courage to embrace uncomfortable truths and build justice on their foundation will determine whether future generations inherit a world worth celebrating, or one consumed by the lies their ancestors refused to abandon. The machinery of mythology operates through repetition, embedding itself so deeply in consciousness that questioning it feels like betraying everything you've ever known. Every November, the same ritual unfolds across America. Grocery stores transform their aisles into shrines of false memory. Television networks broadcast specials that reinforce the same comfortable lies. Schools organize pageants where children unknowingly celebrate mass murder while their parents beam with pride. This isn't accidental programming. It's systematic indoctrination designed to make Americans incapable of recognizing genocide when it's happening right in front of them. The same techniques used to transform massacre celebrations into gratitude holidays continue operating today, shaping how people understand everything from foreign wars to environmental destruction to police violence against communities of color. Consider what happens in a typical American elementary school during the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. Teachers who genuinely care about their students plan activities they believe will teach important values. They read picture books about friendship and sharing. They organize craft projects, making paper headdresses and pilgrim hats. They prepare classroom feasts where children act out scenes of intercultural harmony that never existed. The children absorb these lessons with the complete trust that young minds bring to adult authority. They learn that differences between cultures can be resolved through goodwill and cooperation. They discover that sharing resources leads to mutual prosperity. They understand that America was founded on principles of friendship and religious freedom. Every single lesson is a lie, but it feels true because it comes wrapped in love and celebration. These same children grow into adults who cannot comprehend why indigenous peoples protest pipelines crossing their sacred lands. They've been programmed to believe that cultural conflicts result from misunderstanding rather than structural violence. They think economic inequality stems from individual choices rather than systemic exploitation. They assume environmental destruction happens because people don't care enough about nature rather than because entire economic systems depend on extraction and pollution. The mythology doesn't just shape how Americans understand domestic issues. It creates the psychological foundation for accepting imperial violence abroad. When government officials claim military interventions are humanitarian missions, they're using narrative frameworks established through centuries of Thanksgiving celebrations. The same story structure that transformed colonization into cooperation allows Americans to see bombing campaigns as liberation efforts. Children who learn that pilgrims helped indigenous peoples by bringing civilization to the wilderness grow into adults who believe American soldiers help other countries by bringing democracy to backwards regions. The mythology teaches them that resistance to American influence results from ignorance rather than legitimate grievances about exploitation and domination. This indoctrination proves remarkably durable because it operates through emotion rather than logic. People don't believe Thanksgiving mythology because they've examined historical evidence and concluded it's accurate. They believe it because it makes them feel good about themselves, their families, and their country. Challenging the mythology therefore feels like an attack on identity rather than a correction of factual errors. The emotional investment becomes even stronger when the mythology gets tangled with religious beliefs about divine providence and American exceptionalism. Many Christians see Thanksgiving as a holy day that celebrates God's blessing on a chosen nation. They interpret early colonial success as evidence of divine favor rather than demographic catastrophe caused by disease and violence. This theological framework makes historical criticism feel like spiritual rebellion. Questioning whether pilgrims and Indians really shared a peaceful feast becomes equivalent to questioning whether God guides human history. Acknowledging that American prosperity was built through genocide and slavery challenges, beliefs about divine justice and moral order that provide meaning and comfort to millions of people. Religious institutions reinforce these connections by holding special Thanksgiving services that blend patriotic and spiritual themes. Pastors deliver sermons praising America as a Christian nation founded on biblical principles. They lead prayers thanking God for religious freedom and constitutional protections, while ignoring how those freedoms were denied to indigenous peoples, whose lands were stolen to create the country they're celebrating. The fusion of religious and patriotic mythology creates cognitive barriers that persist even when people encounter overwhelming evidence contradicting their beliefs. They can learn about boarding schools, broken treaties, and systematic massacres while maintaining faith in America's fundamental righteousness. The factual information gets compartmentalized as unfortunate exceptions rather than integrated as evidence of systematic violence. This compartmentalization allows Americans to express sympathy for historical injustices while continuing to participate in systems that perpetuate those injustices. They can acknowledge that terrible things happen to Native Americans while celebrating holidays that commemorate those terrible things. They can support diversity and inclusion while living on stolen land and benefiting from colonial wealth extraction. The psychological mechanisms enabling these contradictions are the same ones that allow people to function in other exploitative systems. Workers can labor for corporations destroying the environment while caring about their children's future. Consumers can buy products made by enslaved workers while opposing human trafficking. Citizens can pay taxes funding imperial wars while considering themselves peaceful people. These contradictions persist because the systems creating them also create narratives justifying them. Corporate propaganda makes environmental destruction feel like economic progress. Government messaging makes imperial wars feel like humanitarian interventions. Educational curricula make genocide feel like cultural exchange and mutual benefit. Understanding how Thanksgiving mythology operates therefore provides insight into how all forms of systematic deception function in American society. The most effective propaganda doesn't rely on obvious falsehoods people can easily reject. It creates stories that feel emotionally satisfying while obscuring uncomfortable realities about how power actually works. The Thanksgiving myth succeeds because it addresses fundamental human needs for meaning, belonging, and moral coherence. People want to believe they come from good families and good communities. They want their traditions to reflect positive values. They want their ancestors to have been heroes rather than perpetrators of violence. The mythology provides all of this while requiring nothing except willful ignorance about historical facts. But this willful ignorance comes at enormous cost to everyone trapped within systems built on lies. When foundational stories about national identity are myths, people lose the ability to distinguish between myth and reality in other contexts. They become vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who understands how to exploit their emotional investments in comfortable narratives. Contemporary political movements use the same techniques that created Thanksgiving mythology to advance agendas that would horrify Americans if they understood what was actually happening. Politicians reframe corporate welfare as free market economics. They present voter suppression as election integrity. They describe environmental deregulation as economic freedom. They transform imperial aggression into humanitarian intervention. Americans conditioned to accept narrative reversals through Thanksgiving celebrations become easy targets for these rhetorical manipulations. They've already learned to prioritize emotional comfort over factual accuracy. They've been trained to trust authority figures over their own observations. They've developed habits of celebrating systems that harm them while calling it blessing. The mythology also shapes how Americans understand social movements challenging existing power structures. If you believe historical problems were resolved through cooperation and goodwill rather than organized resistance, you're likely to view contemporary protests as unnecessarily confrontational. If you think progress happens through gradual reform rather than fundamental transformation, you'll oppose movements demanding systemic change. The Thanksgiving narrative teaches Americans that justice emerges naturally when good people of different backgrounds come together with mutual respect. This makes them susceptible to superficial solutions that focus on individual attitudes rather than structural inequalities. They think racism can be eliminated through diversity training rather than wealth redistribution. They believe environmental problems can be solved through consumer choices rather than regulatory transformation. These individualistic approaches to collective problems flow directly from mythology, portraying historical change as the result of personal relationships rather than political and economic forces. The myth erases the reality that colonial relationships were determined by power imbalances, resource competition, and imperial expansion, presenting them instead as friendships that developed through mutual understanding. When Americans apply this framework to contemporary issues, they consistently focus on changing hearts and minds, rather than changing laws and institutions. They organize dialogue sessions instead of demanding policy reforms. They promote cultural sensitivity training instead of supporting reparations programs. They call for more communication rather than more redistribution of resources and decision-making power. These approaches reliably fail because they don't address the structural forces creating the problems they're trying to solve. But the mythology makes it difficult for Americans to understand why their well-intentioned efforts don't succeed. They keep trying the same strategies while expecting different results, trapped in patterns of thinking that prevent them from seeing alternatives. The mythology creates enormous resistance to learning from communities that have maintained alternative approaches to these challenges for centuries. If you believe indigenous peoples were primitive societies that benefited from European contact, you're unlikely to consider indigenous knowledge systems as sources of wisdom for contemporary crises. This dismissal deprives Americans of access to sophisticated understandings of sustainable economics, ecological relationships, and collective decision-making that could help address multiple interconnected problems simultaneously. Indigenous communities have developed practices for maintaining cultural continuity across generations, making decisions that account for impacts on future generations, and living in reciprocal relationships with natural systems. But accessing this knowledge requires recognizing indigenous peoples as contemporary teachers rather than historical curiosities. It means acknowledging that colonization was destructive rather than beneficial. It means understanding that indigenous sovereignty and land rights are prerequisites for environmental and social justice rather than obstacles to economic progress. The Thanksgiving mythology makes these recognitions nearly impossible because it inverts actual relationships between colonizers and colonized, presenting victims as beneficiaries and destroyers as benefactors. This inversion doesn't just distort historical understanding, it prevents contemporary learning that could benefit everyone facing ecological and social crises. Climate scientists increasingly recognize that indigenous communities protect biodiversity more effectively than government agencies or private conservation organizations. Indigenous managed territories contain the vast majority of remaining biodiversity, despite comprising a small fraction of global land area. Indigenous agricultural practices maintain genetic diversity in food systems, while industrial agriculture creates dangerous monocultures, vulnerable to climate change. But mainstream environmental movements often ignore or marginalize indigenous leadership because participants have been trained to see indigenous peoples as noble but primitive figures from the past, rather than sophisticated contemporary actors with essential expertise for planetary survival. This marginalization reflects the same colonial mindset that created Thanksgiving mythology. It assumes European-derived knowledge systems are inherently superior to indigenous ones, even when evidence demonstrates the opposite. It prioritizes technological solutions over ecological wisdom, individual innovation over collective knowledge, short-term profit over long-term sustainability. Breaking free from these patterns requires more than learning new facts about what happened in 1621. It requires developing entirely different frameworks for understanding relationships between peoples, between humans and natural systems, between past and present. It means recognizing that the same worldview justifying genocide against indigenous peoples continues driving destruction of ecosystems sustaining all life. The fossil fuel corporations funding climate denial campaigns use identical narrative strategies that transformed massacre celebrations into gratitude holidays. They reframe environmental destruction as economic development. They present corporate profit as public benefit. They describe short-term extraction as long-term prosperity. They fund politicians and media figures who repeat these narratives while suppressing contradictory information. Americans conditioned to accept mythological thinking through Thanksgiving celebrations become prime targets for this propaganda. They've learned to prioritize emotional comfort over factual accuracy. They've been trained to trust authority figures over direct observation. They've developed habits of celebrating systems harming them while calling it progress. The connections between historical and contemporary propaganda become clear when you understand that many of the same institutions created both. Universities that developed curricula celebrating westward expansion also train economists and scientists who justify environmental destruction. Corporations that profited from territorial conquest evolved into companies extracting fossil fuels from indigenous lands. Government agencies that implemented genocide continue violating indigenous sovereignty to access natural resources. These aren't separate problems requiring separate solutions. They're manifestations of the same colonial system that began with European invasion and continues through contemporary forms of extraction and exploitation. Understanding this continuity reveals opportunities for building movements addressing multiple injustices simultaneously rather than treating them as unrelated issues. Indigenous communities have been leading this integrated approach for decades, connecting struggles for land rights with environmental protection, cultural preservation with climate action, sovereignty with social justice. Their organizing provides models for building coalitions challenging root causes of interconnected crises, rather than just addressing symptoms through piecemeal reforms. Supporting these movements requires abandoning mythological thinking that Thanksgiving celebrations reinforce every November. It means recognizing that Indigenous peoples are leading fights for everyone's survival, not just their own. It means understanding that their victories against pipelines and mining companies benefit all communities threatened by environmental destruction and resource extraction. This recognition could transform how Americans approach Thanksgiving and other holidays celebrating colonial mythology. Instead of gathering to give thanks for blessings obtained through genocide, families could use these occasions to learn about Indigenous struggles and support Indigenous-led organizations. Instead of teaching children to celebrate cultural harmony that never existed, educators could help them understand how different groups relate to each other within systems of power and resistance. These changes don't require eliminating gratitude or family gatherings. They require grounding these practices in reality rather than mythology. Families can express appreciation for their relationships and opportunities while acknowledging how those opportunities were created. They can maintain traditions while educating themselves about the true history of territories they inhabit. Some communities have already begun this transformation, creating alternative ways to observe November that honor truth rather than perpetuate lies. They organize educational events about Indigenous history and contemporary struggles. They host fundraisers for Indigenous-led organizations, fighting for land rights and environmental protection. They use social media platforms to amplify Indigenous voices rather than colonial narratives. Educational institutions are slowly responding to pressure for more accurate and inclusive curricula. Though progress remains limited by political resistance and institutional inertia. Some schools now include Indigenous perspectives in their November lessons, while others have eliminated traditional Thanksgiving activities entirely from their academic programming. These changes face fierce opposition from Americans who benefit from maintaining mythological thinking. Politicians pass laws restricting how teachers can discuss historical injustices and their contemporary impacts. Corporate interests fund campaigns preserving traditional narratives that prevent critical analysis of power structures. Religious leaders use sermons to reinforce mythological interpretations of American history, supporting their theological and political agendas. The resistance reveals how deeply Thanksgiving mythology is embedded in American identity, and how threatening accurate history feels to people who have built worldviews on comfortable lies. Challenging the holiday feels like attacking family traditions, religious beliefs, and patriotic values simultaneously. But maintaining these lies ultimately threatens everything Americans claim to value. Democracy cannot function when citizens believe false stories about how their political systems developed. Environmental protection remains impossible when people celebrate holidays, justifying destruction of Indigenous communities and ecosystems. Social justice stays unachievable when foundational narratives erase experiences of oppressed groups. The choice facing Americans is therefore not between tradition and change, but between myths enabling destruction and truths that could enable healing. The mythology of Thanksgiving has served its purpose of making Americans comfortable with genocide and colonization. But comfort built on lies cannot provide foundation for addressing crises that mythology helped create. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the real history behind America's most beloved holiday. We've peeled back layers of carefully constructed mythology to reveal the truth that's been hidden in plain sight for generations. The smiling pilgrims and grateful Indians sharing a peaceful feast never existed. What did exist was genocide, enslavement, disease, and systematic extermination, wrapped in the language of divine providence and national destiny. But understanding this truth isn't about destroying tradition or making people feel guilty about their family gatherings. It's about finally having the courage to build something real on foundations of honesty rather than comfortable lies. The mythology of Thanksgiving has served its purpose of making Americans feel good about conquest and colonization. Now it's time to choose between celebrating pleasant fiction or confronting difficult reality. Indigenous communities have been showing us this path forward for centuries, maintaining their cultures and resistance despite everything designed to destroy them. Their survival proves that transformation is possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Their contemporary struggles for sovereignty and environmental protection offer models for building a future based on justice rather than exploitation. The choice is yours. Every November, you can gather around tables to perpetuate myths that celebrate genocide, or you can use those moments to plant seeds of historical consciousness that could grow into movements for genuine change. The children learning accurate history today will inherit whatever world we choose to create, through our actions or our silence. The time for comfortable myths has ended. The time for uncomfortable truths has arrived. Whether we have the courage to embrace that truth and build justice on its foundation will determine not just our own future, but the future of all peoples sharing this land and this planet.